Jesus rides the subway with the junkies and the freaks. Jesus rides the subway with the hustlers and the creeps. He rubs shoulders with the thieves, and he looks a lot like everyone he sees. Jesus rides the subway while the pretty people sleep. But he says you can lay your burden down. You can lay your burden down. Oh, maybe you've been kicked around. You can lay your burden down. Jesus strolls the sidewalk on the wrong side of the track. Jesus strolls the sidewalk that poverty attacks. He makes his home among the shacks where the oppressed have fallen through the cracks. But Jesus strolls the sidewalks while the righteous turn their back. And he says you can lay your burden down. You can lay your burden down. Oh, maybe you've been kicked around, but you can lay your burden down. Jesus went to church today, sat in the back and sang the hymns. Jesus went to church today, they didn't recognize him. But he sang, you can lay your burden down. You can lay your burden down. Oh, maybe you've been kicked around. You can lay your burden down. You can lay your burden down. You can lay your burden down. And maybe you've been kicked around. You can lay your burden down. Grace and peace. Love y'all.
Dry your eyes, I have found my way, and I realize I seem far away, but I had to go, and I'll have you know I am happy where I've landed, and I'm glad to stay. So let your days roll on, even though I'm gone, and let it comfort you to say we will meet again someday. Until then you can go find me where the flowers grow. I'll only ever be that far
Good morning, Greater Purpose. How's everyone doing today? I know you probably could be doing better with stay in place, but hopefully the service is going to give you something that's entertaining and uplifting and that challenges you to make a difference in the world that definitely needs to see one. So happy Sunday. You are affirmed. You are loved at this table regardless of sexual or gender identity. This table is set for kindred shakers of empire, the fiercely hospitable and devout arbiters of goodwill toward humanity. Now, a couple of announcements before we move into the sermon. In the description of this video is a link for the Zoom Fellowship Hour. So after everything's done, click on that and join us and have a drink with us. It's going to be a good time. We're not collecting tithes at all. We ask that if you have a need, if you feel like you want to post it in the comment section, please do that. Church, if you've got Venmo or PayPal and you feel like you can help meet the financial needs of those that comment, please do so during this time of crisis. Get you a grain product, set it to the side like a cracker, and also get you some wine, set it to the side, because at the end of this service we're going to do communion together remotely, and also pour you out an adult beverage. I've got some bourbon here with my name on it. Not really, it's got Elijah Craig's name on it, but still. Enjoy you an adult beverage. This is a PG-13 church. Finally, also please share this video on your page. You might have some friends that need to hear a positive message from a church that uplifts science and the LGBT community and fights for the marginalized and stands on the right side of history for once. And it's a good idea to mention this before we move any further. I know these are a lot of announcements, but this is important. Some of the things we talk about can be a little bit triggering for some folks. We talk about some heavy topics, and if you need to step away or pause the video or come back to it, or maybe you just need to sit this one out, that's okay. We definitely don't want to shy away from talking about difficult subjects, but we understand that it's difficult for some people to participate in that dialogue. So if you need to step away, that's more than fine. I want to do a quick recap because we might have some new folks jumping on this week. So if you're joining us for the first time, we're doing a deep dive into the Hebrew Bible, aka the Old Testament, and we have been doing so through the scholarly materials presented by Professor Christine Hayes of Yale University. And this has been an absolutely fascinating journey for us because it is far more thorough than anything I have heard from Christian scholarship regarding the Old Testament. And that's likely because Professor Hayes is Jewish. She's a Jewish scholar. And as a Jewish person, Professor Hayes is far more familiar with this set of texts than most Christians are. Now, let's recap. Thus far, we have talked about how the Hebrew Bible is a composition of 4 sources, the J, E, D, and P sources, and the Hebrew Bible is kind of a blending of these sources. And the final product that we have access to today was likely compiled by the authors of the P source. We talked about Genesis and how it's not literal, nor would ancient people have taken Genesis literally, nor should we today take Genesis as a scientific document. We talked about how much of the ancient Israelite world disagreed about monotheism and henotheism, which is the belief in many gods but one supreme God, and polytheism, which is just the belief in many gods. And many of these ancient Israelites did actually believe in henotheism or polytheism, and we see verses that actually affirm that. So not everyone that was an ancient Israelite agreed about there being one God. We talked about the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Bible, Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Rebecca, and Isaac, and how many of these characters did not literally exist. They were not literal characters, they were mythical characters. And another mythical character that we talked about was Moses, and how he was certainly not the author of the Torah, which is contrary to what many Christians believe, but he was also probably historically non-existent. But despite that Moses didn't exist, we do know that a group of Israelite captives escaped from Egypt during the reign of Ramses II, or at least this most likely happened. Now, I recommend going back and watching each week's live stream if you missed one of these lessons, because these subjects were totally fascinating. I mean, I learned a lot, and I've been in ministry for 18 years. Now, last week, we discussed biblical law found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And this was quite possibly one of the most educational portions of this recent deep dive for me, which we're going to continue that discussion a little bit today, because so much of what I've been taught about biblical law has been both boring, like insanely boring, and wrong. Let me take a quick sip of some agua here, lubricate the vocal cords. All right, sounding good. All right, so we should say this up front if you're new. The Bible has wisdom that is for us, but it was not written to us. And this is common knowledge within our church community, but it needs to be spoken loudly and repeatedly in America, because evangelicals are now stupidly claiming that a COVID-19 vaccine will be the mark of the beast, and they're constantly spouting off scientific ignorance on a weekly basis, so we should counter that as well. But even though we know that we were not the intended audience of the Bible, an even more important topic is who was the Bible written by. Many conservative evangelicals would typically argue that God wrote the Bible. This is not accurate. Other scholars would say that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Christian and Hebrew Bible, were said to have been written by Moses. But that is not historically accurate either, as we just discussed. We certainly know that these texts were not compiled by God, and even though Moses was not the author of the Bible, the authors of the Hebrew Bible were much so human. They were not deities. Now, part of the reason that many assume that God wrote the Bible is many verses in the Torah declare that God was the author. Exodus 31:18 says, when God finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. Now, of course, this was not literally true, but why would the author state such a controversial thing? Clearly, the authors of the Torah are trying to make a point with this claim of divine authorship, especially in regards to biblical law. And this was likely intentional because declaring divine authorship of biblical law had significant cultural implications. Implications that would impact the entirety of ancient Israelite society, that extended beyond the reach of their legislative influence, beyond the influence of their courts. And often these laws were phrased in a way to make it apparent that these regulations were mandated beyond a legal directive. They were mandated beyond anything that the court could enforce, because these directives found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy are often finalized with the authoritative, repetitious statement, "You shall do this, for I, the Lord, am your God." And oftentimes biblical law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy were instructions that would extend beyond the reach of the court's ability to enforce these laws. There are laws about aiding others, and there are laws about not hating others in the Hebrew Bible. Could you imagine Congress passing such laws today? So Hebrew law in many ways encapsulates this holistic approach to society. Morality, judicial practices, and as I just mentioned, even internal motivations are written into Israelite law. Leviticus 19:17 through 18 says this, "You shall not hate in your heart anyone of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God." Love your neighbor as yourself is often quoted in churches as being a strictly gospel mandate in most Christian churches. But once again, that notion is coming from anti-Semitic teachings. We see that loving your neighbor as yourself is quite clearly placed in the Hebrew Bible. And though Jesus certainly valued this ideology above all others according to the gospel, Jesus was certainly not the originator of the idea that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. Also, quick side note. I love that this passage in Leviticus says that if you do not call your neighbors out, if you do not call out wickedness, that you yourself will also be guilty. Now, that methodology does not fit comfortably in the confines of westernized Christian theology, but call-out culture in many ways was ancient Israel's rabbinic culture and theology. Back to the sermon. So what is biblical law? So is this Bible like full of moral laws and rules that's meant to be enforced individually? Or is biblical law criminal and societal legislation that's meant to be governed? Yes, that's right. It is both. Unlike modern judicial systems, the Bible did not separate law by matters of state and matters of internal motive and individual person's preferences. This means that every crime in the Hebrew Bible, every crime against humanity, is also a sin. As Professor Hayes at Yale says, what is legal in the Hebrew Bible is also moral. According to the ancient Israelites, what is immoral was also illegal. Those things were interconnected for them. They did not separate morality and legality, unlike what we see even in our own society today. This means that the Bible does not just suggest the care for the marginalized and the impoverished. It actually legislates these practices and ratifies them into their laws. For example, according to the Hebrew Bible, the corners of your field and all food that is dropped on the ground during your harvest must be left for the poor to harvest. And that's biblical law. Meeting the needs of the elderly and those who are ill or differently abled is mandated by law in the Hebrew Bible. Not just suggested, it's actually mandated. So for the ancient Israelite, compassion was ratified into their legal system. It wasn't just something that was celebrated or suggested. And not just for their own members of society. Strangers and foreigners, immigrants, they must have their needs attended to, not by biblical or spiritual inspiration, but according to their actual governing laws and principles. They had to be done. Even the welfare of animals is mandated in Levitical law. And this was a radical concept compared to other ancient Near Eastern religions and cults. Many sacred texts during this time claimed to uphold the interest of the oppressed and claimed to seek justice, but their text was diametrically opposed to just policy. In the Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye was only applicable if you were of a higher class and the offender was of a higher class. So you had to be of the same social standing and you both had to be wealthy people. However, if a person of high social caliber physically harmed or even murdered another in the Code of Hammurabi, then the rich would only be subjected to pay a fine. Nothing more. So this iniquity was unacceptable for ancient Israelites. And for them, there was one standard of law that was applied to all citizens, regardless of their social standing. In fact, 2 crimes would get you put to death regardless of your social prowess: murder and adultery. Remember, adultery was not just one person cheating or having an affair, but rather one man having sex with a married woman. Concubines, external marital affairs, those were permissible, but sleeping with someone else's wife was a crime. And this crime was severe, not just because ancient societies were all misogynistic, and they were. It was severe for the ancient Israelites because for them, marriage was a sacrament. It represented the relationship that humans were meant to have with God. But regardless, if one was caught in either murder or adultery, either one of these carnal sins, the consequence and standard for the aftermath was identical for poor and rich alike. Again, this was not true for other Near Eastern religions in which their laws and ordinances served the interest of those that were wealthy, and only those that were wealthy. So not only were consequences identical for all classes in ancient Israel, but stricter financial regulations were placed on the upper class, according to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And how I wish that was true in America today. But that was true for the ancient Israelites. In Deuteronomy, low interest or no interest loans, they must be given by the rich to the poor as the poor had need. As the impoverished would come to a rich person, they were obligated by their legal system to give that loan to the person that was in poverty. Not only that, but every 7 years, all debts must be forgiven. This was called the year of Jubilee. All of this is quite positive, but I want to say this too. Like all cultures, the ancient Israelites were not perfect. They were a far cry from it. And we would do well to also acknowledge that the Bible does enforce the toxic institution of slavery. And we all know that the institution of slavery is the epitome of sin. It's why, thank God, we've abolished it in America. Though we are a far cry from having a just society for people of color and the marginalized, we've at least abolished the institution of slavery. But we would also do well to remember that the Bible was not written within our modern standard of ethics. And this next point is fascinating. Though we must never condone, so don't hear what I'm not saying, we must never condone or revere slave labor ever. If we were to compare the institution of slavery found in the Hebrew Bible versus surrounding Near Eastern religions, and even comparing their system of slavery to the horrific slavery within the history of the United States, we would see that it was not similar in the least. Firstly, slaves, again, slavery is wrong no matter what, so don't think I'm condoning this. But in the Hebrew Bible, slaves were more like indentured servants. They were not captured, they were actually indebted. This means that they could not be slaves for more than 6 years because of their practice of the year of Jubilee every 7 years and all debts being forgiven. And then they would be freed. So these folks owed rich people money. So they were working off their debt. Already, this is vastly different than many cultures in global history, including America's. Secondly, according to Exodus 21, if any master physically harmed a slave, if they even knocked out a tooth, which in their mind, a tooth was a non-essential organ, so you were free in a lot of Near Eastern societies to remove a tooth because it wasn't considered something that was vital to survive. But for the ancient Israelites, that was unacceptable. If you physically harmed a slave in any way, shape, or form, that slave, that indentured servant, must be set free at the moment of harm, and all of their debts from that moment on were to be forgiven according to biblical law. Now, Israelite slaves were also entitled to a day off. The Sabbath day of rest was present for them, and any fugitive Israelite that was trying to escape an abusive master, if they were somehow discovered in another land by another Israelite, they were never to be returned to that abusive master according to biblical law, which is far removed from what we saw in the horrific practices of slave labor in the United States. A lot of these slaves were taken back to their masters or punished by death. That was not the case in ancient Israel. If you escaped an abusive master, you were to be left alone. Again, all forms of slavery are immoral. Please hear that. But ancient Israelites mandated by law a far more ethical culture regarding slavery than any other Near Eastern society of that time. And I would argue that it was far less horrific than America's history with slave labor. Now, the biggest difference between biblical law and other Near Eastern religious codes was that biblical law was upheld by valuing the sanctity of human life in every situation. Punishment by death in other Near Eastern religions was only reserved for people that committed theft or property crimes. Maybe they stole some property or they damaged property. Then those people in other Near Eastern religions could be put to death. But that wasn't permissible in the Hebrew Bible. Because in the Torah, death was only consequential if murder or adultery were committed. Again, marriage symbolized their relationship to God, which is why adultery was taken so seriously. In other cultures during this time, death and adultery could be remedied, or murder and adultery could be remedied by oligarchs simply paying a fine. That was not the case in the Levitical text. Do you see the difference? The Hebrew Bible was filled with radically new ideas regarding judicial systems, and it had more obligations in society in which the notion of class and the concept of privilege was abolished. This is a good stopping point for us today. Click like if you're with me so far. Good deal. I'd like to conclude today's sermon by giving us a modern application, but I need to first be clear about something. Not everything in the Bible is wholesome, and much of it is scientifically ignorant, to say it politely, because science didn't exist when it was written. So if we want to apply the wisdom of the Bible individually and even corporately throughout American society, then we must take it so seriously that we refuse to take it all literally, because we know the history of how it was compiled. This text was written by people that did not accurately understand the mechanics of the universe, nor did they have the most equitable views of society, even though their view of slavery was better than even America's view of slavery a couple hundred years ago. It doesn't excuse the fact that slavery is wrong, and it is permissible in the scriptures. What I'm saying, as we unpack the culture and the history of the ancient Israelites, is that even though their morality was far from perfect, it was ethically superior to many surrounding cults, many surrounding societies, and many surrounding religious views. And even though anti-Semitic American Christians have a tendency to view the Hebrew Bible as morally inferior to the New Testament and morally inferior to American values, I've concluded so far in the study that in many ways the opposite was true, with the exception of how we treat women in American society, which is still far from ethical. We still don't have equal rights for women, but compared to how the ancient Israelites treated women, we're doing a little bit better. But Western culture has cherry-picked the Bible to endorse horrific practices like slavery, when in reality the Hebrew Bible endorsed a form of temporary indentured servitude. Both wrong, but I would argue that the Bible's view is far more ethically superior. Again, still morally wrong, but far less menacing than what America did to black people for centuries. And we have yet to repent or make reparations for this grave sin and stain on our nation's past. The Bible commands debt forgiveness and no interest loans. We discussed that last week, that ancient Jewish peoples like natives viewed their livestock and prey as sacred. Their method of killing their food required a quick and painless death, as well as livestock being adequately cared for in the confines of that animal's lifespan. The Israelites' diet was far more environmentally conscious than our own, and environmental regulation was actually put into their laws. Immigrants, refugees, and strangers were welcomed. They were cared for, not by suggestion from sermons and scriptures, by their legal system. These things had to happen. Society had safety net programs for the poor that were mandated by both state and temple. Charity was legally required in ancient Israelite society. Therefore, we must conclude that capitalism is not just morally wrong according to Leviticus. It is not just a spiritual sin. It is a societal regression that is far less sustainable and just according to what these ancients experienced 2,000 years ago. Am I advocating for society to return to Levitical law? No, of course not. As I said, there are aspects of Levitical law that should remain in the framework of civilizations past. But I am saying that in many ways, our modern economic and societal constructs are morally inferior to what ancient Israelites had 2,000 years ago. We are regressing as a species. Maybe not in regards to our technological advances or in our advances of healthcare, but certainly in regards to moral principle. We are regressing as a species. So what do? We move forward. We build a society that is ethically superior to what is depicted in the Bible and what surrounds us in America. One of the greatest evolutionary gifts in the age of humanity is the human ability to reflect and assess. So let's look back on human history and let's restore what was useful. Let's restore what was morally superior, but let's leave behind what wasn't beneficial. Let's leave behind what was and is harmful, namely capitalism. There's a mythical bird for the people of Ghana called the Sankofa bird, and this bird has the ability to fly forward while always looking backward. This intended imagery of this mythic fowl is that as a species, we must always move forward, but we can also selectively apply wisdom from the past. And that's my prayer for America. That's my prayer for the church. That's my prayer for my children and my children's children. And that's my challenge to all of you, to create a society that does just that. So let's move forward while taking only what is good, only what is right from the past, and let's leave everything else in the wake of progress. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, Jesus took bread and broke it. And Jesus said, "This is my body, broken for you. Take and eat, and as often as you do, do so in remembrance of me." Likewise, he poured out some wine and he passed it to his disciples. And Jesus said, "This is my blood." It represents the blood of a new covenant, a new promise. Take and drink, and as often as you do, do so in remembrance of me. Church, when you take this bread that represents life and you take from the cup that is a cup of blessing, may you remember that your life is meant to be a blessing and restore goodness to this world. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness. May it guide you through the wasteland and protect you through the storm. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you. And may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.